In the autumn of 1891, in a small Nebraska town barely wide enough to hold its own name, a man made a decision that cost him everything, and he didn't even notice until the bottle was empty. He signed his daughter over to settle a gambling debt, handed her across a poker table like a deed to land he'd never worked, and rode off before morning light could make him feel ashamed. What that hollow man didn't understand was that the creditor waiting on the other side of that debt, a weathered, solitary rancher named Cord Dellacroix, was not the kind of man his daughter had any reason to fear. This is what happened after. Millhaven, Nebraska sat at the crease between two low hills, the kind of town that appeared on no important map and apologized for nothing. The main street held a dry goods store, a post office the size of a coat closet, a church with a cracked bell, and a saloon that did more business than all the rest combined. It was in that saloon on a Tuesday night in October that Bertram Hollis lost the last thing he had left to lose. He'd started the evening with $40, a wool coat, and a horse. By midnight, the horse was gone. By 2 in the morning, so was the coat. By the time the other men at the table grew tired of watching him sweat, Bertram owed more than he could scrape together in 3 seasons of hard work. Work he hadn't done in years. Cord Dellacroix sat across from him, his cards face down, his expression unchanged. He was 41 years old and looked it honestly, deep lines around the eyes, gray threading his dark hair at the temples, hands that carried the proof of 2 decades of ranch work in their every knuckle. He hadn't come to Millhaven to gamble. He'd come to settle a feed bill and buy salt. The poker game had been an accident of timing, the way trouble usually was. He didn't want Bertram's money. He had enough. What he said next, he said quietly, so only the 2 of them could hear it. "Pay what you owe or I'll take the girl." Your choice. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. He meant it the way a man speaks when he's trying to force a drunk to reckon with the size of his stupidity. But Bertram Hollis was 3 parts whiskey and 1 part desperation, and he nodded before Cord could walk it back. The next morning at 6:15, a young woman appeared on the porch of Cord's rented room at the boarding house. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and a book pressed against her chest like armor. Her name was Willa Hollis. She was 26 years old, and she had known since dawn what had been decided for her. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked at Cord Dellacroix with eyes the color of creek water in winter, clear and still and measuring, and she said, "I understand the arrangement. I'll work for what I eat." Cord looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was cold and flat. Down the street, a dog barked at something it couldn't catch. "There is no arrangement," he said. "You don't owe me anything." Her chin lifted, just slightly. "My father signed a paper." "Your father signed a paper drunk, in a card game, at 2 in the morning. He picked up his hat from the post beside the door. "That's not a legal document. That's a mistake." Willa was quiet. He could see her working through it, checking the edges of what he'd said for places where it might not hold. "Then what am I supposed to do?" she asked. Cord turned his hat in his hands. His ranch was 2 days north. He had 1,000 acres, 400 cattle, a dog named Briar, and a kitchen that hadn't smelled like anything good since his wife had died 3 years prior. He had no children, no family nearby, no one who came to check on him at Christmas or asked whether he'd eaten. He should have said he didn't know. He should have put her on a stage and sent her somewhere sensible. Instead, he said, "Do you cook?" She looked at him like the question was almost insulting. "Better than you, I'd guess." That, he said, was probably true. They left Millhaven before 8. The wagon moved north through gray October fields, the horses steady, the sky low with cloud. Willa sat on the bench beside him, straight-backed, hands in her lap, watching the road the way someone watches a door they're not sure will open. He gave her the canteen without being asked, just held it out when they passed the first hour. She took it and thanked him, which was more courtesy than he'd expected from someone who had every right to be furious. They made camp at dark beside a stand of cottonwoods. Cord built the fire. She arranged the cookpot before he thought to mention there was one. By the time the stew was done, neither of them had said much, but the silence between them had shifted from wary to simply quiet. After supper, she read by the firelight, the same book she'd carried against her chest all morning. He didn't ask what it was. He watched the fire and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest he came to peace these days. When she fell asleep sitting up, the book open across her knees, he draped his spare blanket over her shoulders without waking her. Then he sat with his back to the wagon wheel and kept watch until the stars faded. The Dellacroix ranch appeared the following evening as the sun dropped behind the ridge, all long shadow and amber light. It was a working ranch, not a pretty one. The barn needed paint. The fence posts leaned at irregular angles. The garden beside the house had given up entirely sometime around midsummer. But the house was solid. The roof held. The windows were whole. Willa studied it without speaking. "It's not much to look at," Cord said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "It looks like it means to stay." He hadn't thought of it that way before. He supposed she was right. Inside, the rooms were clean in the sparse way of a man who kept surfaces clear but couldn't quite manage warmth. The kitchen was functional. The wood stove worked. There was food enough in the cellar, though not a great variety. He showed her the small room at the back of the house, separate from the rest, with its own latch on the inside of the door. "The lock turns from your side," he said. She tested it. It did. He left her there and went to check on the horses. That night, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, Cord smelled food cooking when he came in from the barn. Not the gray, dutiful smell of something just kept warm, but actual cooking. Something with onions and dried sage, and the particular comfort of bread beginning to rise. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and stood there like a man who had forgotten he was allowed to come inside. Willa glanced over her shoulder. She didn't comment on his expression. "There's coffee," she said. He sat down at the kitchen table and did not say a single word about how the house already felt different with her in it. She had been there 3 days when she found the ledger. It was sitting on the corner of his desk, open to a column of numbers that didn't add up in his favor. She wasn't snooping. She'd been looking for paper to write a letter to her cousin in Iowa, and the ledger was just sitting there, open with a pencil laid across a calculation that was wrong. She picked up the pencil and corrected it. Then she sat down and worked backward through the last 2 pages, because the error hadn't started where she'd found it. When Cord came in from the morning feed and saw her at his desk, he stopped. "I wasn't prying," she said, without looking up. "You're overpaying your supplier by 12%. It's been compounding since March." He stood there for a moment. "How do you know that?" he asked. "My mother kept the accounts for my father's store before he drank the store away. She taught me." Cord sat down in the chair across from the desk. He looked at the corrected column. He didn't say anything for a while. "Can I look at the rest?" she asked. He pushed the ledger toward her. She spent 2 hours on it that morning. When she was done, she set the pencil down and turned the ledger to face him. She had found 3 separate discrepancies, corrected a running error in the cattle tally, and identified a feed contract that was costing him $40 a year more than the going rate. He read what she'd written. He read it again. He said, "You do this by memory?" "I was doing it by your records. They were incomplete." He looked at her. She had ink on her finger where she'd pressed the pencil too hard. She was 26 years old and the most capable person who had sat at that desk in 3 years, including himself. "He didn't say thank you," he said. "The contract renews in December. We should renegotiate before then." She nodded. "I thought so too." By the end of the 2nd week, she knew the names of his horses, the particular temperament of the east pasture set fence that came loose whenever the wind shifted north, and which floorboard in the hallway creaked just before dawn. She had organized the cellar by season, mended 2 saddles, and taught herself the routing of his cattle survey by walking it once on a Wednesday morning. The ranch hand, a taciturn man of 50 named Buck, watched all of this with an expression of profound relief that he shared with no one. By the end of the third week, Cord had stopped bracing himself when he came inside. It was small, the shift. The kind of thing a man wouldn't admit noticing, but the kitchen was warm, and there was always coffee. And occasionally she left a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth on the corner of his desk when he worked late. And he ate it without mentioning it, and neither of them spoke about what it meant that she knew he was still in there working. In November, the first real cold came. With it came a woman named Gertrude Ashby, the wife of the county land assessor, who arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning in a buggy she handled with unnecessary force and an expression she wore like a badge. She was not unkind by nature, but she was the kind of woman who considered herself the guardian of certain standards, and she had heard things about the situation at the Dellacroix ranch that troubled her on a civic level. Willa met her at the door. Gertrude looked her up and down in the way that some women do, finding the full account in seconds, tallying what she approved of and what she didn't. She was clearly accounting for the flour on Willa's hands, the fact that Willa's hair was pinned back for work, the absence of apology in Willa's posture. "I've heard the story," Gertrude said, "about how you came to be here." Willa looked at her evenly. "I imagine most people in the county have heard some version of it." Gertrude's mouth tightened. "You understand how it looks." "I understand how it began," Willa said. "Whether it reflects on my character is a different question, and I'm not the one who should have to answer it." Gertrude blinked. "I keep this house," Willa continued, in the same quiet, measured tone she used for everything. "I keep the accounts. I know this land as well as any hand on it. If the county would like to question the worth of that, they're welcome to compare my records to their own." Gertrude stood there for a moment, recalibrating. Then she said, "The bread. I can smell it from here. It's sourdough." Willa stepped back from the door. "Come in, if you'd like." Gertrude came in. She stayed for an hour. She left with a loaf of bread and a corrected calculation for her husband's land assessment that Willa had caught in 5 minutes, a mistake that had been costing the Ashby family money for 2 tax years. At the door, Gertrude said, "You're not what I expected." Willa smiled just slightly. "Most things worth knowing aren't." That Saturday, Cord drove into town for supplies, and Willa sat beside him on the wagon bench. She wore her wool coat and a hat that had seen better years but sat on her head with dignity. He noticed she sat straight in the way that meant she was expecting to have to, which told him she already knew what was waiting. Millhaven in November was not a large stage, but it was an attentive audience. At the dry goods counter, the storekeeper, a long-jawed man named Polk, handled their order in a silence loaded with opinion. 2 women near the bolt cloth whispered without troubling to lower their voices. One of them, Cord, didn't know her name, only that she attended the Methodist church and considered that fact a credential, looked directly at Willa and said, "Some folks have no sense of proper standing." Cord set down the bag of coffee he'd been about to pay for. He turned. He was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't now, he said. "This woman manages my accounts, keeps my home, and works harder before noon than most men do in a day. She reads Latin out of a grammar book she carries in her bag. She can identify a lame tendon on a horse in 10 seconds and corrected an error in Ashby's land assessment that his own husband missed for 2 years. You want to tell me more about standing? Go ahead." The store was silent enough to hear the candle burn. Willa's hands were still. She did not look triumphant. She looked the way someone looks when they are not surprised, but still feel the weight of a thing lifting. Cord picked the coffee back up, paid for it, touched his hat to Polk. Then he held the door for her, and they walked out into the cold November air. She didn't say anything until they reached the wagon. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." He helped her up to the bench. "I know," he said. They drove home without speaking, which, between them, had started to mean something different than it used to. By December, the ranch had changed in ways that didn't show up in the ledger but were just as real. The house smelled like rosemary and firewood. The kitchen window had a small pot of winter herbs on the sill that Willa had started from seed. The bookshelf in the sitting room had new volumes alongside the old ones. She'd ordered them from a catalog, practical titles, a medical reference, a surveying manual, a history of territorial land law, and he'd found himself reading them in the evenings when she wasn't. Buck had stopped eating alone at the bunkhouse. He came to the kitchen table for supper, a habit that had begun without anyone declaring it, and he brought the conversation with him, quiet as it was. She had mended the argument between Buck and the two seasonal hands without either of them knowing she'd done it. She'd simply managed the schedule differently, arranged the work so the men rarely had cause to rub against each other before noon, and by the time they did, the day had mostly gone too well to sour. Cord noticed. He didn't say so. He noticed more than he said, which was a habit he was aware of and not entirely proud of. He thought about her in the barn when he was working. He thought about the way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window in the evenings, looking out at the dark pasture with an expression he couldn't name, not sad exactly, not exactly at peace, something in between, something that looked like a person learning to trust that the ground would hold. He thought about the fact that she'd come here as the settlement of a debt, and that she stayed because there was nowhere else, and he thought about how that was not the same thing as choosing. He didn't say any of this. He started mending the garden fence instead, in December, which was not the mending season, and if Willa noticed, she didn't say anything about that either. January brought a blizzard that pinned the ranch for 4 days. On the third evening, with the wind driving snow against the windows, and the fire burned low in the sitting room, Cord came in from the last check on the animals to find Willa sitting on the floor beside the hearth, mending bridle leather by the last of the firelight, a blanket across her shoulders. He sat down in the chair nearby and didn't pretend he was there for any reason in particular. She said, without looking up, "My mother used to say that a man who mends things when they don't need mending is trying to say something he doesn't have words for." He was quiet. "The fence," she said. "In December." He looked at the fire. She let him sit with it for a moment. Then she said, "I've been here 3 months. I came here because I had no choice. But I want you to know, and I've thought about how to say this, so it's not something I'm saying easily. I've come to think of this place as somewhere I would have chosen if I'd been given the chance to choose." The fire popped. The snow drove against the glass. Cord looked at his hands. "You should have had that chance," he said. "You should have had it from the start." She looked up then and met his eyes. "I know," she said. "But here's where I am." He nodded once, slowly. Then, "May I?" He stopped, started again. "I'd like to." He stopped a second time. "This is not something I'm good at." She waited. He said finally, "I don't want you here because of a debt. I want you here because of everything that came after. Because of who you are. I'd like, if you're willing, to court you properly, to ask permission, to do it right." She looked at him for a long moment. The bridle leather was still in her hands. Then she said, "You're asking my permission. It's the only way that means something." Her eyes went bright in the firelight. "Yes," she said. "You may." He reached out and covered her hand with his. Her fingers turned over and held his back. Outside, the blizzard covered everything in white and made the world new. 6 weeks later, Bertram Hollis reappeared. He came on a gray February morning, thin and shabbier than before. His horse lame in the left foreleg, his coat not suited to the season. He stopped at the ranch gate and called out Willa's name as if he had every right to. Willa was in the kitchen. She heard him through the window and stood very still, for a moment, her hands on the edge of the basin. Then she dried them on her apron and walked outside. Cord had come from the barn. He stood near the gate, not blocking it, but present. Buck was somewhere behind him, quiet. Bertram looked at the house, the mended fence, the smoke from the chimney, the evidence of a life made whole, and something crossed his face that might have been shame if he'd had more practice with it. He said, "Girl, I've had a rough winter." Willa stood at the top of the porch step. She said, "I imagine you have. I could use some help." He shifted in the saddle. "You're doing well here, I can see that. Just a few weeks, I wouldn't be any trouble." She looked at him for a long time, not with anger, with the kind of clear, settled vision that only comes to people who've spent real time learning to see. "You signed me over like property," she said. At a card table, in the dark, he flinched. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't live inside me somewhere," she continued. "But I'm not going to carry it as hatred either. You are my father. You were also the worst thing that happened to me, and you were the reason the best thing did." Bertram's face worked through several expressions without landing on one. "You can eat," she said. "Cord will give your horse some attention. You'll sleep in the bunkhouse tonight if the weather's bad, and you'll be on your way in the morning." Bertram looked at Cord. Cord said nothing. He just unlatched the gate. That night, Bertram ate at the kitchen table without speaking much. He looked at the bookshelves. He looked at the herbs on the windowsill. He looked at the way Cord passed the bread to Willa before anyone else. Without ceremony, as if it were simply the order of things. By morning he was gone. They never saw him again. Spring came the way it always does in Nebraska. Not kindly, but honestly. The ground thawed in sections. The mud season arrived and behaved like mud season does, and the ranch work tripled overnight. New calves, fence damage from the winter. The east pasture needed regrading. Willa and Cord married on a Saturday in April, at the small church on the road into Millhaven, in a ceremony that lasted 20 minutes and required no performance. She wore a dress she'd sewn herself from pale gray wool, simple and good. He wore his better coat. Buck stood up beside Cord. Gertrude Ashby sat in the third pew and cried in the dignified way of women who would deny it if asked. Afterward, in the churchyard, people came to speak to them. Polk from the dry goods store shook Cord's hand, and then, after a brief internal negotiation, shook Willa's too. The woman who had spoken at the bolt cloth in November did not come, but her friend did, and she looked at Willa with an expression that had rearranged itself considerably since autumn. Gertrude Ashby brought them a pie and said, "This town didn't know what to make of you." Willa took the pie. "They never do," she said, "until they do." Gertrude laughed, which surprised them both. Outside the church, in the pale April sun, Cord put his hand at the small of Willa's back. It was a quiet gesture, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. She looked up at him. He said, "Ready to go home?" She said, "I've been ready for months." They rode out of Millhaven to the sound of nothing in particular, which was by then their favorite sound. 5 years on, the Dellacroix ranch was a different kind of place. Not louder. It had never been a loud ranch, but fuller. The barn had been repainted, barn red, the way Willa had always thought a barn ought to be. The garden beside the house had recovered its ambition and then exceeded it. Tomatoes and squash in summer, winter greens in the cold months, and along the fence line, a straggle of wild roses that Willa had transplanted from the creek bed and that no one had expected to survive. They had. Their daughter, Edith, was 3 years old and had her mother's eyes, and her father's stubbornness, and a shrieking laugh that could clear a room or fill it, depending on the occasion. She followed Buck around the yard with the single-minded devotion of the very young, demanding explanations for everything he did, and Buck, who had never spoken more than 20 words in a row to any adult, answered her every question with the patience of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask. They had a second hand now, a young man named Pell, who'd come north from Kansas, and stayed because no one had told him to leave. He was learning the accounts from Willa, slowly, and she was a demanding teacher, which was exactly what the accounts required. On a warm October evening, 5 years to the month after Cord had first driven north with a woman he didn't know sitting beside him on the wagon bench, Willa stood on the porch of the house she had come to as a stranger and stayed in as herself. The sun was going down behind the ridge. The cattle were in. Edith was asleep on the floor of the sitting room, having refused the bed, which was a battle. Willa had stopped fighting around the 3rd week of that particular phase. Cord was somewhere in the barn, doing the last check the way he always did. The same slow circuit in the same order, finishing at the same horse, the old chestnut mare, who had been their first purchase after the wedding and who had developed a series of strong opinions about when she preferred to be brushed. Willa heard his boots on the porch steps before she saw him. He came and stood beside her, looking out at the same dark ridge, the same stars beginning. She said, "Do you remember what you said to me in Millhaven?" The first morning, he considered. "I said there was no arrangement. You said I didn't owe you anything." He nodded. "I've thought about that a lot over the years," she said. "What it meant that the first thing you did was tell me I was free, even when I didn't feel it yet." Cord was quiet for a moment. Then, "I knew what it looked like. I needed you to know I knew." She turned to look at him. "My father thought he was trading a liability," she said. "And you spent 5 years proving to everyone in this county, including me, that he was wrong about that." Cord looked at her steadily. He said, "He was wrong before we ever left Millhaven." She smiled at that, the kind of smile that doesn't need to be large to mean everything. Below them, in the pasture, the mare stamped once in the dark. Inside, Edith laughed in her sleep, sharp and sudden, and gone, like something wonderful passing through. Worth, Willa had learned, was not a fixed thing. It was not handed to you by the people who claimed to know its price. It was something you built slowly, in the same way you built everything that lasted, with your hands and your patience, and the willingness to stay when staying required something real. She reached over and found Cord's hand in the dark. He held it, and the night settled around them, over the ranch they had made from silence and good work. And the particular grace that comes to people who choose each other freely. Without debt, without ceremony. Without anything except the slow and certain knowledge that this was where they were meant to be.